Okay. Can you please tell us your name and where you were born?
Yes, I'm Gertrude Goetz, Gertrude Goetz. I was born in Vienna, September 7th, 1931.
And can you tell us a little bit about your early life, what it was like growing up?
Yes. I was an only child. I had a sister who died before I was born. And my parents we were middle-class people. We were a very small family. And my parents had a little store, dry goods store, different wools and threads and other merchandise. And my parents were rather socialistically inclined as far as their political attitude and philosophy. And my father was actually a second-generation Viennese. My mother had originally come from Czechoslovakia. She was born in the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, and she had come to Vienna in her teens, 15, as an orphan. And we lived in a very much gentle area. The home life was such that I was very little exposed to Jewish background. I mean, I was aware that I was Jewish as a child, but my mother did not believe in anything. And she had herself Jewish upbringing, Jewish religious upbringing, but she did not impart any of that on me. And my father had come from a very religious home. He sort of adapted himself to my mother, to his wife. So up to the time that I entered first grade, I really knew very little about Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, except for one Jewish family who lived in the same apartment house, and they had come from Eastern Europe. The children were born in Vienna, and the children were my best friends. And so I would see Friday night a little bit of the Jewish tradition in their house.
They practiced more Judaism.
They practiced more so. And so I was aware I was Jewish, but none of the things that go with it. I mean, just as a label that it was affixed to me. When I went to first grade, of course, I was told that every day there would be prayers, and that I was the only Jewish child in class, that I would stand up and just not participate. Going back to the first few impressions of my childhood and the impending Holocaust, or the impending coming of the Nazis, there was a great deal of apprehension already in the mid-30s for the events that were happening in Germany. And there were many Austrian sympathizers, Nazi sympathizers, who were fermenting and were just waiting for a takeover by Germany of Austria as well.
Did you experience anti-Semitism?
The first few years, per se, not. But of course, there was a great deal of already, my parents, some of their pastime or hobby was to do politicking, political discussions, and that was really true of many, more so of European Jews. They were very much involved of the events, and they had lived through World War I, and now they saw another war coming, and I had heard a great deal about World War I, and I was very apprehensive. After all, I grew up in a time when you could not see visually what war is like on television or in the movies, so the imagination ran rampant. What could this war that was on verge of happening again could be like? So anxieties all along. Now, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism in Austria. The Jews in Vienna, most of the Austrian Jews lived in Vienna, and 9/10 of the Austrian Jews were Viennese-based, and they were about 1% of the Viennese population. The Viennese Jews, most of them were in the liberal professions. They were in medicine and law and so on. And economically, Austria was very much impoverished, was sort of landlocked country, and the Austrian middle class and lower middle class, there was a great deal of jealousy and envy regard vis-a-vis the Jewish bourgeoisie, because most of the Jews were middle class bourgeois. So the times were very, there was a great deal of upheaval, especially after 34, 35. There was a great deal of anxiety already. The Jewish community was seeing what was happening in Germany, and they were very apprehensive. And it became rather like a debilitated type of community, you know. My first recollections specifically of fear, of anxiety, was the night of, I believe it was March 12, 1938, when the Chancellor of Austria, Schuschnigg, went on the radio, and he resigned in face of the Nazi takeover, of annexation by Germany of Austria. I remember specifically because at that point we were at my grandmother's house. It was like late at night, maybe 9:30 or something. The lights were out, and we all listened to the radio. And the chancellor said something to the effect, "This is the beginning of the end." And many of the Jews listened to that broadcast with very ominous feelings, because they really realized now all their fears were becoming realities. And after the broadcast was over, you know, I heard my parents and my grandmother and my aunt going on with, you know, discussing more in detail of all their anxieties. So that was one of the first few real moments of that it came home. I was at that time only 6 years old, 6 and a few months. In the ensuing months, I have to retrace a moment. With the annexation of Austria, Austria became known as the Ostmark. With the annexation on March 13 and the march of the Nazis into Austria, there was a great deal of violence, immediate violence against the Jews. Actually, the next ensuing months, the violence against the Jews in Austria was much more severe than in Germany. In Germany, the Nazis had taken over in 1933, and for 5.5 years, slowly, the measures against the Jews had sort of evolved, slowly, surely, but on a more an interval. In Austria, it just, within a year, it was much more severe than in Germany. Initially, when they annexed, as Hitler marched into Vienna, there was immediately violence against the Jews, beating up, taking people to prison, looting, and so on.
Towards your family too?
Some of it went by the wayside. The outside world didn't pay as much attention, because it was sort of taken, well, it's part of an annexation, it's part of a taking over process, a natural procedure. The Jews were taken out to scrubbing and surrendering their goods and so on.
Do you remember how that affected your family?
It affected my family only in the sense of always speaking about it at home, being submissive, being worried what could happen next. And of course you live from day to day, not to be apprehended on the street, not to be dragged out and what have you. Then months after the annexation of Austria, some of the violence subsided. But by May, 2 months later, it started up again, and about 4,000 Viennese Jews were taken to concentration camp, to Dachau. And many, many stores were closed. Again, we were able to avert, my parents were able to avert being, you know, part of the victim, to be victimized at that time.
How did they do that, do you know?
Well, it was just luck. It was just possibly because we lived and the store was in an area that was completely Gentile, and there wasn't such a concentration of Jews that they would come and surround and have easy access on. There was a great deal of fear and a great deal of, as a child, I remember my grandmother, my aunt, and my father always exhorting my mother, who was a very outspoken woman. And as I said, she had sort of socialistic views. And she was exhorted not to speak up, not to get into any kind of discussion, because it could mean serious trouble. And I remember that I was very fearful. I almost felt I'm responsible for her. I would always feel when I would walk with her that she should not get into trouble. There were very real fears. Mm-hmm. And I remember specifically one day we were on a streetcar. I don't know where we were going, and she did get into a discussion with a Nazi. Apparently the Nazi, at that point, many of the Austrian Nazis put on swastika on the lapel, and so if you didn't have a swastika, you could very much be a Jew. Anyway, the man asked her to get up because she's a Jewish from her seat, and she would not, and they got in a discussion, and the man said, well, I will take you, I will arrest you, I will make a citizen's arrest, and I will take you to the Gestapo. And I was getting more panicky and panicky. I didn't know what to do. Everybody disregarded me. I was just a little kid. Anyway, we ended up, the streetcar was stopped, we were taken off, and we had to march to the Nazi headquarters. And they took my mother into the building and left me standing outside, and for 2 hours I did not realize what was happening. I was very fearful. I felt this is the end now. This is what she had been told and alerted to, not to get into trouble. There was no way that I could notify anybody. There were no such amenities as a corner phone booth or money on me. So I was marching up 2.5 hours. It seemed, at least. It could have been an hour and a half, I don't know. And they released her, and they warned her. Naturally, from then on, she seemed to be a little bit more subdued. But over and over again, she would get into some kind of altercation with neighbors, with pro-Nazi neighbors or business partners. And so there was always that very real fear about my mother.
The fear was what?
That she should not get into any kind of compromising situation vis-a-vis Nazis, because it could mean, jail. At that point, we didn't think that it could mean loss of life. Mm-hmm. This was 1938, yet it was before the war.
And you tried to protect her from getting into this. How did you do that?
Well, I just was very apprehensive. I would target her. I would take her hand. I would feel that I'm sure that I couldn't articulate to her my fears, but I felt that if I would sort of hold on to her, and as if it were a reminder for her I was, fearful. Anyway, as the months went on, we had to, in Vienna, there are many public apartment houses, buildings erected by the city of Vienna. And Jews who lived in apartments erected by the city of Vienna, due to the racial laws and restrictions, had to vacate the apartment. And also in May 1938, I believe, that in one of these pogroms, they closed our store. Now, many of the people who had to vacate their apartment were then relegated in sort of ghetto-like areas of Vienna. Many Viennese Jews, however, had other families, so they went to live with. We went to live with my grandmother and my aunt. The apartment had to be let to a Nazi member, to a party member. And the same man bought the store from us. Literally, he did not have to pay us for the store or the apartment. He had the right to take it. He had the right to get this. But he apparently, if I remember correctly, my parents always talking about it, that he was a fairly decent man. And I found out about 5 years ago that my father, after the war, was in touch with him by mail. I corresponded with him, and I always said to my mother, well, what happened, She said, well, he was very decent to us in those times. So we had to let the apartment, and we went to live with my grandmother. Now, I had...
What was that change like for you?
Yes, I'd like just to say a moment about... I had gone first to public school, regular public school, the first grade. At the end of first grade, the Jewish children could no longer go to regular public school. So I was taken out, and with 5 other children in our building area, apartment building house, we were sent to a Jewish school. And suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was exposed to more of my cultural background and heritage. And that did not last very long, because then we had to move with my grandmother. And at that point, I had to go again to a public school. I started 2nd grade, and we went to a regular public school. The first level of the school, the first floor, was given to Gentile children, and the Jewish children had to go to the upper floors. Same time, but different areas, segregation in that sense. And I remember each day we had to assemble in the courtyard, and then we had to march upstairs. Now, on the landing, there was a a complete mural picture of Adolf Hitler. And some of us children, every time we walked by, we had been taught a kind of feelings against this man who personified all the things that our parents were going through. We would make remarks. And one day, one of the kids spat on the big mural painting of Hitler, and our whole school was punished. We were assembled, and we were for a week we could not attend school. The teachers we had were Jews, because at that point no longer could a Gentile teach Jewish children. If I may regress a moment, my parents both worked in the store, and I had a nanny, a young woman who was very dedicated to me, and I loved her and her husband very much. And as the racial laws came into being, she could no longer take care of me. But yet, I was part of her family. And so she would take me to her home. But as times went by, they became more apprehensive of associating with a Jewish child and Jewish people. And so when I would go over to their house, they would put a little swastika on me, because you had to transverse public places, you had to transverse public park. And by that time, already in public institutions, public parks, and certain streets, there was a sign for Jews and dogs not allowed. So they would put a swastika on me, and I felt all right going with them. And I remember one specific incident that we traversed the park, and they met some neighbors of theirs. And then there was a great deal of discussion. Maybe it is even too dangerous that possibly these neighbors could turn them in. So these are all vignettes of experiences. And it again added to the feeling of anxiety. I mean, maybe I didn't belong anymore to be with them.
And what you're describing is that you didn't belong anywhere.
Yes, I felt very much like that. But they were very nice, and they always tried to get in touch with us. And as a matter of fact, in the first few years after we left Austria, they sent me, they sent me after the war, some gifts and so on. But they were very decent people and very nice, and they were like my second family. But so when we moved to my grandmother, times were going very bad. The store, my father tried to reopen the store, but business wasn't going very well. And the Jewish community in general in Vienna was very impoverished at that point. About 1/3 of the Jewish population was on soup kitchens. You know, the Quakers apparently helped some of the Jewish people, and they established like soup kitchen and rations. My father couldn't work. The store wasn't going very well, and for a time it had been closed. And we had to surrender whatever we had. You know, there was a edict to submit all the silverware. Another time it was an edict of surrendering other goods and so on. So times were very difficult, and luckily we had an uncle in Budapest who was quite affluent, and he helped us. As a matter of fact, he went on to help us for many years, even while we were in Italy, and until he himself was taken away to a concentration camp. But we really think that my parents, when I say we, my parents always felt that he helped us survive in many respects, the little bit of help that he sent us monthly of money. So this went on until November 9th, 1938. My father was taken to Dachau. How it came about, I remember very well. We had like the custodian or the of the house, of the apartment house, like the janitor and custodian of the apartment house, Gentile people, came to my grandmother and they said, listen, your son is going to come home today, because at that point we lived already with my grandmother. Alert him not to come home because we have heard that they're picking up the Jews. So we were just terrified. We tried to call my father in the store, but he had left already. And then we did hear, we saw some cars pulling up outside the building, and we saw some police descending and knocking at the landlady, at the custodian's door. And we opened our door to listen in, and in fact they were asking if there are any Jewish people in the building. And she had to, of course, admit that the Jews lived there. We were the only Jewish family in the building. And they wanted to come and arrest my father. And she said, look, he's not home. He's not home. And we were listening in on all this. And for a child, it was a terrifying feeling, you know. And they left. We learned later that my father was on the way to my grandmother's house, and on the way, he was stopped by a policeman. And my father didn't look Jewish at all. My father looked very Viennese. I mean, even now when I go back in Vienna, he looked just... But he was stopped nonetheless because he didn't have a swastika on, and they were picking up the Jews. So he was stopped by the policeman and asked if he's Jewish. And my father said yes. So the policeman said, you better come with me. But apparently he was a decent enough individual in the sense, in those times you appreciate any token of decency, any minor gesture. And we found out later that the policeman, so my father said, look, I'm just on my way from the store to do some purchasing. And the policeman said, well, look, do you have any money on you? My father said, I had 800 shilling or whatever it was. I don't know what the comparative value is. And the policeman said, well, if you have someone that you can leave it in safekeeping before I take you to jail. So as a matter of fact, my father, they were just walking by in an area where he knew some people. And my father left the money with these people who notified us then that he was picked up. But this was a gesture that the policeman didn't have to do. Anyway, my father was picked up. In the meantime, they came and picked up my mother and my grandmother. My grandma was like 60. She had very poor vision. And in those days, when you were 60, it was more like being 90 now. Anyway, they picked her up, my mother and my grandmother, to go scrubbing and cleaning up pavements in the city, because November 9th, about 43 synagogues in Vienna had been demolished, burned, or ruined almost to smithereens. So they took the Jewish women, anybody under 60, to clean up and scrub. And while they were cleaning up, of course, the Austrian Gentile population was standing around and just cheering on and taunting the people. And if possibly one or a few might have spoken up meekly, they were threatened. So the people were intimidated even to show any kind of sympathy.
So where did you go when your mother and grandmother had to go to
Well,
work?
I was at that time I think I was in school, and when I came home, my aunt was home. My aunt wasn't picked up because my aunt had a Yugoslav passport. My aunt was married to Yugoslav, so that's why she had certain rights, probably not for long, but at that point. So for 2 days, for a day and a half, we really didn't know where my grandmother is and my mother. Of course, we didn't know where my father is. My aunt tells me that she tried to make investigations, tried to find out where they had taken him. They had picked up about 8,000, I think something like that, or 5,000 Austrian Jews, Viennese Jews at that sweep, and had put them in various schools and prisons and kept them. So my aunt was a business manager of a Jewish firm that the people had just left a few weeks before for Palestine, clandestinely, and she was still in charge of this business that had then, in the subsequent weeks, been given over to a Nazi sympathizer, to an Austrian Gentile. And he was, my aunt says he really wasn't a bad fellow at that point. He had come from low ranks, and suddenly he was in charge of all this very good business. So my aunt pleaded with him to find out where my father is, just where they had taken him. We didn't even know where he was. So he made a few phone calls. And he apparently had a high rank within the Nazi hierarchy. And he made a few phone calls. He made some attempts. And my aunt said, and then at one point he called higher and higher up to find out what had happened to my father. And finally he was admonished on the phone, listen, you better stop this investigation because it could mean trouble for you. Why I'm bringing it out is because, again, it shows even if there was a certain decency in him, but came to a point where he was threatened too. Mm-hmm. He did find out in the course of events that my father had been taken to a certain school, and then we didn't hear very much until 2 weeks later, I believe it was, we received a card from Dachau. It was a prescribed card. It was just like a little postcard, and the inmates of Dachau were allowed to write only 2 or 3 sentences, so and so many words, and just sentences limiting themselves to the state of welfare, the immediate, And somehow or other, we were already relieved to know where he was. We had heard about concentration camp, but we weren't quite aware. At least we knew he was alive, and he's writing to us. So in the meantime, my mother undertook, like many other women and other Jewish people, undertook all kinds of attempts to get their husbands released. And she was many times at the German Gestapo with papers, and then we even dragged out, my father had earned during World War I a cross, I don't know if it was a metal cross, iron cross, whatever it was. He was in the Italian-Austrian campaign, and you did anything to prove that you had been a good Austrian Viennese citizen and that you had always done your duty, and possibly that they would take pity on you and feel, well, you are not a Jew, you are really first an Austrian first, and then well, the provisions in order to get out of Dachau at that time, in 38, 39, the Germans, the Nazis, still wanted the Jews out. It was in their interest to have them out. The final solution hadn't come into concrete planning yet. They wanted them out for, first of all, they wanted Germany and Austria Judenfrei and devoid of Jews. And secondly, the Jews leaving Austria and Germany had to leave everything behind at that point. Before that, Jews could still take something out. But in 39, the provisions in order to leave Austria were you could only take 10 marks with you. Now, Jews who had had some kind of premonition of things that were going to happen and who had been affluent enough, had possibly some money in Switzerland or had jewelry hidden or whatever. But middle class, lower middle class people just could not, didn't have all these means. Also, you had to have a country that would accept you. You had to have an exit visa in order to leave Vienna, Austria. So the Austrian Jews were trying very hard to see where one could go. We had an affidavit to come to the United States, and we had hoped that our visa would come about and within that period of time, and we would be able to leave before the war would actually come about. So the affidavit was not, at that time, it depended not only on your quota, but also depended how strong an affidavit was. Financially secured affidavit, how strong the people secured the affidavit, how much security were they putting down for the people they were sponsoring. Well, our affidavit wasn't apparently that strong. It had been given by some acquaintances of my uncle. Anyway, so there wasn't much hope of going immediately to the United States. So we tried to get an exit permit to go to Shanghai. Many Jews, Viennese, Austrian Jews, and German Jews went to Shanghai. But in order to get some kind of exit visa, you had to have a lot of money, you had to have connections, you had to have a protectia, as they call, and so it was a very difficult thing. And we were scheduled to leave for Shanghai, and I don't know exactly what happened. We did not get that paper. Fortunately, there was a provision by the Italian government, by the fascist government, to let in so many Jews of Austria and Germany in the pre-war years, 38, 39, until July 1st, 1939. I'm not sure if it's July or August 1939, to let some of the Jews into Italy on a temporary basis. We did get such a certificate, such a paper, that we could go to Italy for 6 months, waiting as a transit, waiting to go to the United States. So with this paper, my mother went again to the Nazi authorities, to the Gestapo, and on the basis of that exit visa and entry permit rather not exit visa, but on the basis of that entry permit into Italy, they released my father.
As we move towards, I guess, a period where you're moving towards Italy, can you share with us what that experience was like? I guess you were, 8 years old? What was that like for a little girl?
Yes.
Because the information, it sounds like a lot of the information you've been able to put together since then.
Yes.
What was that like for an 8-year-old little girl to have such upheaval and now leaving your city and going?
Yes.
How did you experience the world?
Well, if I may just interject a moment, because before we left, when my father was released from Dachau, it was a very difficult time for us, because when he came home, he was very depressed, very depressed. He couldn't work. We had a few months to liquidate our business, and he was also, he'd never talked about what happened to him in Dachau. He came home, and I remember like today opening the door, and there he was with his head shaven, and his suit was still all streaked. It was a navy blue suit, but it had sort of caked on. Apparently he had been beaten, and still with the blood on him. And he had been alerted by the Jewish community in Munich on the way out from Dachau. He had been told not to speak of his experiences. The Jews who had come out of the concentration camp at that point were alerted not to speak. And he was a very introverted man anyway, and it just left a tremendous thing on him. But anyway, finally the day of departure came, and we left for Italy, and we felt it was only a temporary thing. I remember the last moment of fear as we were approaching leaving Austria for good. We were approaching the Italian border, and my parents were very worried that would they be able to pass that last test. And sure enough, the police came in and asked if we had 10 marks. And of course, my parents were very upright people, very passive, and we only had 10 marks on us, as the provision called for. And my father even declared the one watch he had and the one ring he had. And so it was just a test again. I was extremely fearful. Would we be able to pass this test? Would we be able to leave Austria and leave this behind us?
And your fear was that your parents would be taken away?
Pardon?
Your fear was that your parents would be taken away?
That they wouldn't let us out. You know, I was aware that, you know, if we stayed, it would mean again, you know, we didn't know what would happen to us. And as I was watching out the train window at the border, I saw something rolling out of the train. And I think that added to my fear. And as the train went by, I saw a human being had jumped from the train window, and he was hurt. You know, he was rolling, and the train came to an abrupt stop, and they apprehended. And I heard my parents say he was being expatriated. He was not a Jew, but he was, you know, as the people were trying to find out what had happened. And he did not want to, apparently he didn't want to leave Austria, didn't want to be extradited and expatriated. Anyway, that sort of added to all these fears. Anyway, we got to Italy, and the first few months were times of mixed feelings because I longed for my grandmother, my friend, didn't speak the language. My parents couldn't work. And all the Austrian Jews and German Jews would assemble every day in a public park, and all they did is deliberate what to do next. Every day there was discussion, should we go to France, should we go to Belgium, where would it be best? We only have a temporary time to stay here in Italy. Italy is moving closer to a Nazi entente, alliance with the Nazis, with Nazi Germany. This certainly wasn't going to be the place to stay.
Where in Italy were you?
This was Milano. There were, at that point, about 10,000 Jews, foreign Jews in Italy, Germany and Austria. I don't know how many we were in Milano at that point, how many. So every day there was this complete deliberation and what to do. What to do. You heard reports people went into France and then people committing suicide, you know, and into Switzerland was very difficult. And again, you had to have money.
How did you experience all that talk? Did you have trouble sleeping at night? Did you have trouble eating? I mean, what was that like?
I don't recall. I don't think I had apprehensions, but I don't recall at night. Mm-hmm. I was a sickly child. I wasn't too strong a child. I suffered for years of bronchial type of thing, and I was sick most of the time in Milano, the climate and so on. But anyway, so my parents didn't know. Money we didn't have. We were aided by the Della Sem, which is the Italian branch of the Joint. Apparently they were getting from the American Joint organization money for refugees. We were just getting a pittance, and we were getting this money from my uncle in Hungary. We had a room, and then as my parents got a little more acclimatized, my parents went to work as a butler and a maid, or as a, not so much butler and a maid, that's much too high. My parents decided that they just didn't want to just sit around and politic, and they had to make a living, or a little. And so they went to cleaning houses. They went to clean one house specifically. At that point, the Italian Jews could no longer have Gentile help. So they were very happy to have somebody as inexperienced as my parents to do their work. And they worked for this German Jewish family who had lived in Italy for many years. So my parents worked there. And I was left to my devices because they had to work. And my duty was we had this little room to take care of it and then to go to school with the other children. I was just completely without supervision. There was an Italian, he was really not an Italian Jew, but he was from Lithuania who had lived in Italy, and he was a very kind man. He organized the Jewish refugee children and gave us, he organized the Italian Jewish community, who was quite a wealthy community in Milano. and arranged for funds to be set up so these refugee children would be given every day one warm meal. So every day, at least at lunchtime, we went to this one sort of like a cafeteria, and we were given, we assembled there, and we were given hot food.
And he helped organize this?
Yes, he helped to organize that.
Do you remember who he was?
Yes. Engineer Kalk, as a matter of fact, I met him after the war. He was very nice, really nice, how he took care of the children. And there, through him, again, I was exposed for the first time to really Jewish tradition, because not only the food, but he had to sing Jewish Hebrew songs, and he was steeped in Jewish tradition and religion. So he wanted to pass this on to the children. Many of us German Jewish children and Austrian Jewish children hadn't been exposed to that. So this was all new for us, sort of being together.
Was there a Zionist quality to it?
No. He had been living in Italy for many years, and he had been married to a Gentile. He was divorced, and so he felt this was his social conscience to take care of us. And luckily, I met him after the war, and I was able to thank him for what he had done. And he also saw to it that some of the Jewish children were sometimes taken by the Italian wealthy Jews to maybe a few days to a resort, or maybe given some kind of care in their home. And I was one of his favorites, so he once sent me, and it was like being in a completely different world. I was given for a few days good food and care and a beautiful home. But anyway, so we went to, school was difficult because we were all put into one class because we didn't speak the language. I was put in with kids 17, and I was one of the youngest, age 7. And so we had to go to an Italian Jewish school because, again, at that point, the Italian Jewish children were also separated. And then we were hardly a few months in Italy that Italy went to war. It entered an alliance with the Germans. And my father was taken one fine day and put into prison. He was put into prison not because he was Jewish per se, because the Italian Jews were not in prison at that point in 1940, but he was in prison because he was a political refugee on that basis. We didn't know what would happen to him. I don't remember how long he was in the prison. Anyway, next thing happened to him, they transferred him and interned him in central Italy, in a mountainous area of Italy, in a small little former monastery in the Apennines of Italy. He could write freely to us, and he had the pittance of food, and he had to do some work, but he was treated all right. My mother then went on, and she worked as a maid. She worked as a housekeeper. She worked as a cook. She worked as, she spoke as a nanny to some Jewish children that wanted to learn German. So anyway, we somehow managed those years from her work and from the assistance we're getting from this children's cafeteria and aid that we were getting as such. We were appealing to the Italian government to be together with my father. And finally, 2 years after, a year and a half after our first petition, they allowed us to join him.
So it was a year and a half you didn't see your father?
Yes.
So you were about 9 to 11 or 12 years old?
No, this was, I didn't see him from summer 40, till January 41, when I was just about 10 years old, yes. Not 9 and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And they allowed us to join him in a small village as internees. It was not far from where he had been interned. It was in central Italy, again in a mountainous area. And from then on, although we had a lot of deprivation, a lot of hardships, but it was a small village, and the people were very kind to us. And I think very fondly of the experiences, even though they're mixed with many, many difficult times. but I have warm feelings because I felt that they treated us as human beings. Of course, I didn't rationalize at that time, but now as an adult, looking back at that village and the people in it, and the kind of experience I had, I think, as a matter of fact, I took my own children to see the village a few years ago, 4 years ago, and I was very excited about going back, and I felt, why 2 years out of my life? Why would it mean more than Vienna or other areas? It was because I realized now that the people treated us as human beings.
Well, what village was this?
It's a little village. It's not on the map. It's called Castilenti. And it's, as I said, at the height of Rome, but in the center of Italy, in the Alpines. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the village basically, my parents were not allowed to leave the village. The village was just like 300, 400 people. The social makeup of the village was such. There were the farmers and the poor people, and then there were the aristocracy, so-called, the elite people, and the elite people were all related: the headmaster, the fascist political secretary, the priest, you name it. Anyway, I became friendly. Well, before I want to say this, they treated us very kindly, but with it, they had never seen Jews. So we were this tremendous novelty, the Jews. They'd never seen Jews. As a matter of fact, this village, first of all, was very much isolated. It had electric light, but that was about it. It was isolated as far as from transportation, communication. There was one bus that would come from another neighboring village once a day. So it seemed at that time very far away from anything. So we were a novelty. We were people from the big city, and we were Jews. And after all, the Jews had killed Christ. But they looked at us not with a feeling of hatred, more as something unusual, like being sort of extraterrestrial, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
what was that like for you,
for me,
little girl?
Well, I befriended the daughter of the head teacher, she was the cherished daughter of all these elite people, the niece and so on, of the priest, of the mayor. So I befriended them, and the teacher and the family, they were fascists. As a matter of fact, my friend's father had marched with Mussolini in Rome, so he was one of the black shirts, but they were very kind people, and they took me in. At that point, my mother became very ill. She had had a heart condition ever since she was a young woman. And she was bedridden most of the time. She couldn't get up. She had this heart condition. She was malnutrition. And she had overextended herself in those years that we were without my father. So my feelings at those times were very, very... Besides the anxiety of being sort of relegated, new, ambienting myself, adjusting, being made fun in a way that I was Jewish and taunted by some of the children in a good way. On the other hand, there was also, my parents couldn't work. They had not much, we didn't have much to eat. My mother was, every day, she felt she was going to die. She kept a diary daily. She had a notebook, and she would write letters to my aunt, my father's sister, who at that point was already in the United States. She felt that she wasn't going to make through, and she felt that she should let her know what we had gone through, and that she should then take care of me, you know, as I was going to be her charge. So added to all the other insecurity, there was my mother's health. The way my parents subsisted at that point, they would go every day, even though they were not allowed to step out the village. Nobody said anything. They just would go and collect wood sticks, you know, for a little fireplace we had, and berries, wild berries. We would go pick berries from the bushes, and we would go and collect sort of weeds, you know, like spinach, but they were weeds. And we would cook that. And then we had some clothing left, so we would trade it in for a little bit of flour or sugar, you know. And the Italian family that I befriended, they were very good to me because many times they asked me to spend dinner with them. And then whenever I would go home, they would send food home for my mother.
Did they know she was ill?
Yes, yes. They were very kind, and they always made sure that it would give me a few eggs and this and that and the other. This elite family had also small children, so I would go and babysit with them and take them. First of all, I loved children. I was a child, but I felt I had sort of inclination. So it was fun. I was very attached to the children. But secondly, also because I knew that if I went there, I would get a little bit of food. So in the meantime, the doctor of the village took pity of my mother, and he was much of a doctor. He was retired and so on. But anyway, he ordered that my mother should get daily some injections, some egg concentrate injection, I don't know. But anyway, luckily it helped her, and she became a little stronger, and she was able to regain her strength. And this was important because the months to come, we had to go into hiding, and it was important that she should be. Anyway, as far as schooling was concerned, I was literally not allowed to go to school. But this head teacher, let me attend school, even though it could have meant serious repercussion for him. So I went to third grade and part of fourth grade. In the meantime, some Franciscan nuns had come to town from the Order of St. Francis. So my mother, who always saw to it that I should have schooling, no matter what, that we didn't have to eat or that we were apprehensive of what's going to happen to us, my mother had always insisted that I should. As a matter of fact, we had one English grammar, and she didn't know English, but every day I had to do English grammar lesson with her, the two of us, and it was daily a tragedy. I mean, a child rebelling. And so anyway, the Franciscan nuns came to town, and my mother went to them, and she spoke to the Mother Superior, and she said, look, we're Jews here, we have no money, but I want my child to would you teach her? The nuns actually had come to the village to teach the Italian girls to make their dowry, embroidery and so on. This is how these nuns were making their pittance, their livelihood. So the Mother Superior said, yes, I will take her in, but you have to realize that for us, she's a child that hasn't been baptized, and her soul is really destined to purgatory. So we will have to have the liberty to influence her to our way of life, of our religion, our faith. My mother didn't believe in anything, and she felt, well, we as Jews, this was her contention, suffer enough, so maybe, if this is what she will decide. And so anyway, the nuns were very nice to me. They taught me French and some schooling, and of course they taught me a lot of Catholic religion. They singled me out, favored me, flattered me as a child, and tried to influence me that this was the real religion. They made me read one day a prophecy. I'm just relating this childish incident, but it sort of sheds a light on that the war would end on April 20th, 1943, which was the day of Hitler's birthday. It was one of the apparition of the Virgin Mary, and I don't know which prophecy. And I went home and I said to my mother, Mama, if the war ends on April 20th, that means that the Catholic religion is the real religion. I'm becoming a Catholic. Well, what should I tell you? The war didn't end on April 20th, and so anyway, I was torn because...
Were you disappointed? I mean, did you have a sense of real expectation?
No, because at that point, I have to tell this little incident because it's sort of revealing. The kids would taunt me, kids, boys, older boys, and so on. And they would always taunt me, and they would say, Gertrude, how many Christs are there? And I would say, well, one Jesus Christ, But one day, I don't know what happened. I was like 9, 10 years old. I got mad, and I said, listen, there are 300 Jesus Christ. Now, this boy was the nephew or something of the priest. And naturally, next thing it went to the priest that the Jewish child in town, in village, had said registry on the Jesus Christ. Now, the priest was my friend, and he was the uncle of my girlfriend, but still, the priest had to undertake something. He couldn't have a Jewish child running around saying registry on the Jesus Christ. So we were called into the fascist secretary and the priest and my mother, and I was given a good talking to. And this wouldn't have been as bad, but my mother then tried to make me feel, they said, look, you realize what situation we're in. We have to watch what we say. But this time she'd learned that you cannot be that outspoken. And she made me feel the precariousness of our life. And, I mean, a little incident, but anyway.
Well, no, that's an important incident. It's kind of a shift. In Vienna, you had taken care of your mother in that way.
Yes.
But I guess you also learned some of her spunkiness.
Yes.
In that sense.
Coming back to the nuns and my Jewishness.
We're going to take a break right now, and then we'll come back to the nuns. You're going to talk a little bit more about your experience in Italy.
Yes. So I'll just go over now real quick into how we ended up here.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. Well, you asked me just a few moments ago as if we were aware of the total political picture at the time, how the war was progressing. Yes, we were. Even though I was little, still we were anxious to learn any good turn or any event that could possibly be a sign that the Allies were progressing in their war against the Germans. So we picked up a little news from here, a little news from there. Of course, we didn't have a radio. Even it was against as refugees and internees to have a radio. Paper we didn't get, but some other you could listen to the news, to the broadcast, even though it was propaganda. But you could sift out more or less at least the stages of the war, the breakthrough in Africa, the Russian front, and for us this was like the lifelines. I mean, you know, it could possibly mean that we possibly could survive all this. So we were very much attuned into the thing. I just want to relate one little incident. I felt torn between being Jewish and being possibly Catholic, and one day in school they were playing the Blue Danube, the Viennese waltz, and even though I had suffered in Austria, they had rejected me as an Austrian, as a Gentile, as a human being. I somehow felt very proud. I mean, you felt there was sort of ambivalence. I felt this towards the Italian children. I felt, well, this was my culture, even though when I reasoned it out, I mean, it's just that the child wanted to get some kind of root, some kind of feelings, belonging somewhere. Anyway, I just want to go over very quickly about the situation did get worse and worse for us in the community. Less food, less opportunity. My friend went away, my girlfriend, and so I did see a little less of her family and get a little less food. So then I went to the farmers and I helped them with harvest, and I would go and get over some food. I wouldn't go begging, but it was just, they made me feel at home. They felt I was part of them. And they would say, Gertrude, they would say, you are one of us. You're going to stay here after the war is over. You're going to marry somebody here. You're going to be part of us. And it made me feel good, and yet I felt, well, I'm not really, again, a childish view. But anyway, situation got worse and worse, and the front, luckily, politically, the front, politically and logistically and what have you, militaristically, the Allies had landed at Sicily, and there was a great deal of excitement. Possibly we would be liberated. Possibly we would see the end to all this soon. And Mussolini was toppled in July '43, and an armistice was entered by the Italian government in September 7th, 1943. I'm not sure it was September 7th or September 8th. I remember it being, my birthday September 7th, I felt like, the whole village, everybody was so elated about this armistice. The people felt the end of the war had come. The Italian sympathy had never been with the Germans. They had, even though they had acclaimed Mussolini as their leader, but they had always criticized him. And from the very beginning on, the pact that he entered was Germany. Germany had always been the arch enemy of Italy throughout history, for many centuries. And so their heart never was with Germany anyway. And here, the Italian government that is now in force concludes an armistice. The end of the war has come, and I felt it's my birthday. I couldn't have had a better birthday. This was my birthday gift. Well, it didn't take but a day or two later to find out that the Germans were very swift. The Germans was now in that part of Italy became the occupying force. And we were suddenly under German rule. At that point, we had been under fascist Italian rule. And even though the Germans had for years tried to pressure Italy to surrender the Jews and enforce a similar type of final solution, to have the Jews shipped off to concentration camps and on to Poland for resettlement, what they called resettlement, the fascist government, Mussolini and his fascist government, even though rhetorically was very vehement about anti-racial laws and measures and so on, but much of it was not really followed through with actual deeds, concrete deeds. So anyway, now we became under German occupation, and we realized that possibly we had not seen the end for quite a while yet, and we did not know what would happen to us. Unfortunate for us, the Allies were stuck at Monte Cassino, which just north of Naples, south of Rome, for an 8 months period, or 6 months, 7 months period. There was fierce fighting to gain Monte Cassino and that move on north towards Rome. We were stuck maybe about 200, 250 miles from the front. Maybe it was less, I don't know. We heard daily, we could hear the daily fighting. And my mother thought, well, it would be, the front isn't too far. If we could get a guide to get us across the front to the Allied front. It was a very dangerous thing. You had to have money, which we didn't. And then there were rumors that possibly sometimes guides would take money and deliver you to the Germans. So our first thrill about the armistice and possibly that our end to our predicament had come turned into a very sad and dangerous situation. So my mother, who was she has a great deal of willpower, even though she was sickly, she said, well, now the Italian political party here in the village, the fascists, will not mind if we will leave the village and go to a farm, we just let them know where we are, but so it'd be a little easier for us if the Germans should come to looking for Jews. We would be out of the village and we would be alerted and possibly could scramble for safety. So we talked to the political secretary, who was the uncle of my friend, and he said, fine, I know where you're going, where you'll be, okay, go ahead. So we lived with these farmers for a few months. It was a very difficult situation. My parents slept on a table in the kitchen, and we were burdened to them. And I took care of the sheep for this family. Became a shepherdess. Anyway, cut the story short, the front was stalled, and daily we saw planes crashing and dog fights overhead, and yet nothing was moving. And one day, the political fascist secretary of the community, it was like the mayor, he called us into town, and he said to my mother that a very rabid fascist, very devoted fascist in the village had denounced us, that there were 2 Jewish families in the village. And the Germans had sent orders, as they were picking up Jews all over Italy, in that part of occupied Italy, had sent orders that we should be shipped off to Modena, which was a concentration point from where the Italian Jews were being shipped off to Poland. Now, I have to say this, that we had heard rumors of concentration camps in Poland, of course. We had not heard specifically that people were being gassed. But some or other, the other Jewish family who had come after us, had rumors, apprehension was that being shipped off to Poland was not for resettlement, but it would have meant death. So the political secretary said, look, here's the paper, I show it to you. If you are here in 2 days, I have to surrender you to the Germans. He said, if, however, you will not be here. So my mother, we went back to our farm. We took out 2 suitcases, but now we only have 2 left. And we walked and walked into the really mountainous, forested area of that. And we walked and walked and walked, and we just couldn't anymore. It was snow, it was winter. And we ended up in a little hamlet of maybe 10 families, and it turns out that the daughter, that one of the women in the village was the daughter of the people we had stayed on the farm, and she was very much fascist-oriented. And so if she really wanted to turn us in, she could have turned us in. But at that point, she realized that the fortunes of war had turned. And she said, listen, she said, you know, I know that the Allies will protect you. And when they come, you will have to put in a good word for us. So anyway, we moved on from there to a little forsaken farm where a kind farmer, very poor people, let us have a little stable. It was no bigger than a quarter of this room. And all we had in there was straw and a blanket. And but the point was that we felt that this woman that we had just left in the other hamlet, word would spread that they could denounce us. She could go back to the village where she had family there. She could denounce us if she wanted, but we just didn't know what to do anymore. So we thought, well, we'll take our chance. And we lived there with these poor farmers, very desolated area of the mountains, for 6 or 7 months in hiding. Now, daily there were rumors, the Germans were sweeping through the countryside, picking up Italians for work, Italian men. That had happened even while we were in the village. And my father, of course, had to run with all the other Italians because they would find the men and just ship them off to Germany for labor force. We were always afraid that my father wouldn't be caught because they would detect right away that he's not that he's not Italian, and that he. So anyway, this went on in those mountainous areas as well. But for the most part, my father stayed in a little stable right outside. And the way we lived, we again, weeds and berries, and we would go to bed every day at 5 because we were hungry. Now, my mother devised a very good system. There were farms far apart in the area, and we would go to the Italians. And we would say, we are refugees from the big city. At that time, there were bombardments of the big cities, and people were coming to the little villages. And the Italian farmers didn't question it. We had an accent, but they didn't question. There was not such a hatred of the Jews. They didn't even think that we could be Jewish. And even so, they would have been very kind to us. So we would go and we would say, we're refugees from the big city, and we're very hungry, and we have money. We'd like to buy some bread. Well, of course, it was just a gimmick, just a stratagem to get something. It was begging in a noble form, because at that point the Italians, of course, couldn't do anything with money. Money had no value. So they would say, well, we don't sell bread. But they would say, invariably, they would say, you just wait a moment, and they would go and give us a big slice of bread, or sometimes even a piece of cheese. So we would go on these hoarding trips every day. And one funny day, my mother said, I tell you, in the next village, there's a cardinal. He had been taken from the big city and moved to the little village not far from us there, where we were in hiding. And she said, we have to find out what is happening on the political scene with the campaign, with no radio. So we went to the cardinal, and when we asked for an audience, and my mother told him that we were Jews, and that we wanted to know what was happening, and, you know, that we didn't have, I guess we begged, I suppose. Anyway, or maybe he just reacted. He said, look, I don't have very much. He gave us some money, and he told us where the front was and what some of the latest, bring us up to date. But I remember, like today, that all the way to our hiding place, so-called hiding place, my mother worried that possibly, you know, it's wartime, and possibly you couldn't even trust a saintly man as the cardinal, because he too could turn us in. You know, times of war, you just don't trust anybody. And she felt maybe we shouldn't have gone, maybe we shouldn't have given away ourselves. So again, your apprehension, these are all incidents of... Anyway, fortunately, after much deprivation and fear, June 4th, 1944, June 6, 1944, news reached us that Rome had been liberated and the Germans were retreating. And they were dynamiting all the bridges nearby, and we could hear, you know, and see that the bridges were... So we rejoiced, we must be free, you know. And then, with 2 hours, we felt we're free. 2 hours later, there were rumors that the Germans were back, and, you know. Anyway, finally we felt we were free, and so my mother thought that we should go into the next big town and find out really if this is so. And we left my father and we walked into town. And as we get into the town, they were just marching away a unit of German soldiers. And we had just, the Italians were standing by, and there was a lot of animosity against these Germans being taken away. And here we realized we're free, you know, but our first impulse when we saw these Germans, we felt so sorry for them. I still felt, you know, and my mother went up to these prisoners and spoke to them in German, which was a very dumb, impulsive way, because at that point it was very dangerous. Next thing you know, they grabbed my mother. They thought she's a spy, and we thought that's it, you know. Anyway, we finally, after much upheaval, I thought this is it, you know. I felt that after all, we finally made it, and now look what happened. Anyway, we found out we were free. We found out that there were refugee camps, and that we had to make our way to these refugee camps. So we went back, got our father and our little two suitcases, and the farmer helped us with a donkey to get us moved into the big city, where we could go to the Allied offices and get a truck that would then ship us off to the southern Italy, to the displaced person camp. And so literally in 1944, our liberation had come, and we spent then another 5 years, my father respectively 6 years, as a refugee in various displaced person camps. My mother was sick most of those years. She was in and out of the hospital. And we just hoped to be reunited with my aunt, to come to this country. Thinking back, I mean, they were very difficult years. And yet, as I mentioned before, reflecting back, I was thinking that some of the years were bad, and yet when one is young and a child, they're also happy times. So, and the things that I think back was very warm feeling towards the Italian people and how kind they had been to us. I'd just like to add a little postscript about the fate of my parents and myself. My parents died 3 years ago. They died at the same time, just 5 days apart. And I guess it may be natural to feel at the loss of one's parents similar feelings, but somehow, even though I married at a young age, I was 18 when I got married, and somehow I felt you're still a child to your parents. And when they died, I felt we had been a unit, all those years. We had survived together, that... And before my father died, we went through a very difficult time because he had surgery 5 years ago, and post surgery had some complication, had cataract surgery, and he became disoriented in the hospital. And after he came from the hospital, he had to be patched. He was completely blind for a few days. And he apparently had already symptoms of senility or signs of senility, but we weren't aware of it. And he fell in a very deep depression. It was getting worse and worse, and my mother had no patience with him. I guess she was frightened herself. And he was frightened that he will be turned out of the apartment, that he will lose his bank account, and And then he started out, because my mother was impatient with him, he mixed her up with somebody else living with him. And I would go over and I would say, Papa, but look, this is Mama, And we'd talk, and he would say, yeah, but your mother lost her life during the war in the camp. He mixed up his mother and my mother. My grandmother died in Auschwitz or some such concentration camp. And it got worse. I realized that he didn't even recognize me. He thought that I had lost my life too. He had a child when he was interned, but his wife and I had died. He had one child, died before the war, So I don't know. It all mixed in his mind. And then he threatened to commit suicide one day, and I was at work when I just happened to call him up. I said, Papa, how are you? He says, life isn't worth living. There are things afoot here against the Jews, and I'm going to just finish it. I said, Papa, what are you doing? He says, leave it to me. I know how. I have a big kitchen knife in the kitchen. And I said, please, just wait till I come. And I ran from work, and I thought I'll find a cadaver, And he hadn't done of the kind. I took him, and I told him we'll go under some pretense. I took him to UCLA because I had heard that they had at the neuropsychiatric ward help for. Anyway, the hard time, they committed him there, the psychiatric ward, because he again threatened how he was going to kill himself. Committed him for a few days, and they told me that it was just they hoped it was just a temporary thing, depression departing from reality. And fortunately enough, they treated him, and after a few days he functioned for another 2 years, but he was getting more senile. And we had a lot of trouble at home because I blamed my mother for everything. I felt she had no patience. She didn't, she physically couldn't cope with him either anymore. Anyway, he had sometimes, he used to have most of his life after the war and during the war, nightmares. He was very attached to his mother, and he had lost his mother, and he had these every so often, like, nightmares, and then he started having attacks. The physicians here couldn't figure out what they were. They seemed always to come after a certain upheaval, emotional upheaval, or watching some movie that related to some event of the war. Anyway, the last attack he had, it was sort of like epileptic attacks, but they weren't. They never found out what it was. Took extensive tests. But anyway, so ended up that he became quite senile, and I had to put him into a closed facility. And when I put him in a closed facility, he kept thinking that this is being like Dachau. And he would say to me, please don't come here. Although I don't know if he recognized me. But he would say, please don't come here. This is like being Dachau. There are things against the Jews, and you just watch it. And it was a terrible thing. It's a terrible thing to live through that experience. And then when you think so many years later that it catches up with you, this was the terrible thing. And he thought he's in Dachau. He just...
Or even though it was all over.
Yes.
It
was very upsetting to me, and I mean, maybe he didn't, I felt that you have to live through that, and then you have to relive it, you know. That was very difficult.
Sounds like it. And then your mother died shortly after he died?
She died 5 days later. She didn't know he had died. He just died. Anyway, it was a feeling, I mean, maybe it was an added dimension to one's sense of loss, because I felt, you know, we were such a unit, we had survived, we went through a lot, you know, and I suppose everybody feels that way part of one's life anyway, you know, but
it's powerful.
we had been on the brink many times of losing our lives and hardships, so it felt, you know, how could they die? I mean, we're just a unit, even though, as I said, I've been married 35 years, and...
we just have 2 more minutes left.
Yes.
And maybe we can end on a little bit of an up note. You
Yes.
met your husband, Sam,
Yes.
in the displaced person camp.
Yes.
Can you tell us how you met?
Yes, well, I discovered him almost like at the beach, like young people do. We were in this very nice resort town of a village in Italy. This was our first refugee camp experience after the war. That was the best time we had. It lasted about a year. Then the refugee camps we were in got progressively worse. And we were there already a year in this camp. There were actually, it wasn't so much of a camp, it were villas, beautiful resort homes, empty resort homes, but nevertheless they were beautiful villas that had belonged to fascists, and that the Italian government had requisitioned for refugees. And it was the time of my life, because my parents we were free, we had food, we had no threat, the ocean was beautiful, and I started attending Italian school, regular school, high school, and life was upbeat. And then in 1945, when the war ended, many of at that point there were Yugoslav Gentile partisans in that camp. They were being repatriated to Yugoslavia. There were Yugoslav Jews and German Jews in this camp. Now, in 1945, then the masses of people being liberated from Eastern Europe, Poland, and Hungary were shipped off to southern Italy. It was sort of a departing point for many of them through
Right.
clandestine trips to Palestine at that point.
And so just tell us the incident of meeting Sam.
Well, I don't know what that is, Sonia. If I tell you how I met him, he'll be mad. He was sitting like the little mermaid of Copenhagen on a rock. That's how I met him. And I was only 13 and a half, and I had flirting with a lot of boys. I was having a good time. And then I met him, and he seemed more serious than most. And I had just an unrequited not love affair, but an unrequited attachment to another young man who had left me for my best girlfriend. So I was ready for meeting somebody. And anyway, I met him, and he was very nice and just more serious. And but he then somehow became very possessive. He just didn't like that I befriend all these other. I was going to Italian high school. I had Italian boys coming to see me, and so anyway, and then to show you how childish I was, on my 14th birthday, a few months after I met him, a few weeks, he had gone to Rome, and he had promised to be back on my birthday, and he apparently, I found out later, couldn't get a train back from Rome. They were hitchhiking. They couldn't find the transportation back. This was 1945, after the war, shortly after the war. And he came a day after my birthday. But anyway, on my day of my birthday, I realized, I guess I must have already a very deep attachment to him, and I felt very deserted, and I was very mad at God and everybody that he had not come back on my birthday. It was bad weather, I felt. Everything was sort of sad note on my birthday. Anyway, how childish. But there was sort of an attachment that lasted till today. And
that's neat. And I think that's a good place to end.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.